Welcome to my primary maths and SATs help videos. This video is all about the main methods for written multiplication that we learn in school today. So we're going to start by looking at words that mean multiplication, then how multiplication and addition are linked, how multiplication and division are linked. Then we're going to look at how to use a number line to multiply whole numbers, then how to use place value to multiply both whole numbers and decimals by numbers like 10, 100 and 1000, etc. Then we're going to move on to looking at how to use the grid method to multiply whole numbers, and towards the end of the video I've shown how you can use this method to multiply decimals, and finally we're going to look at how to use the column method to multiply whole numbers and decimals. So that we know when to use multiplication to solve maths questions, we need first to recognise the words associated with it, and these include multiply, groups of, times, lots of, and product, and the last one is particularly important. We also need to understand how multiplication is linked with other mathematical operations, and here we're going to look at how multiplication is linked with addition. So just as with addition, when we multiply, we're making something bigger. So for example, if we take 3 and multiply it by 2, the result is 6, or we could say the product is 6. And if we take 4 and add on 5, the result is 9. So in both cases we can see that the answer is bigger. Also, multiplication is the same as repeated addition, in other words, repeatedly adding the same number, and this will be explained further in a moment. And here we're going to look at how multiplication and division are linked. When we multiply, we already know that we make something bigger. When we divide, we make something smaller. So we say that multiplication and division are inverse or opposite operations. For more information on how to divide, please see my video on division. So we're going to start by looking at how to use a number line to multiply, and this is where the concept of multiplication being the same as repeated addition comes in other words, adding on the same number each time. If we look at an example times table, here the 2 times table, and look at the answers, we also call those products or multiples, we can see that actually we're also adding on to each time. So 2 plus 2 is 4, plus 2 is 6, and so on. And this applies to every times table. So in the 3 times table, we'll be adding on 3 each time, and in the 4 times table, 4 each time, and so on. So if we start with this example here, 35 times 6, we can also read this as 35 groups of 6, or if we were to swap the numbers round, 6 groups of 35. And that's also important with multiplication. Just as with addition, we can swap those numbers round and it will give the same answer. So 35 times 6 will give the same answer as 6 times 35. So we're going to read it for our purposes now as 6 groups of 35, and we'll see why in a moment. So the first thing we do is draw a number line, and we put a 0 at the front. And what we're going to do is we're going to add on groups of 35, 6 groups of 35. So if we add on 35 to 0, that's one group, we come to 35. A second group gives us 70. 3 groups comes to 105, adding on 35 each time. Add on another 35 is 140, that's 4 groups. 5 groups comes to 175, and then the 6th group gives us 210, and that's our final answer. So we can see why we've chosen to read this as 6 groups of 35 instead of 35 groups of 6, because if we'd have chosen the first version, that would have given us a huge number line with 35 loops on it. So if we look at a second example, this is 5 times 24. We can read this as 5 groups of 24 or 25 groups of 5. It would give us the same answer. Again, we're going to choose the one with the smaller number of groups to use on our number line, which is the first version. So 5 groups of 24. We draw our number line, we put a 0 at the front, and now we're going to count on 5 groups of 24. So add on 24, that's one group, comes to 24. Second group comes to 48. Third gives us 72. Add on another 24, gives us 96. And then the fifth group gives us 120. And that's our final answer. So we've looked at how to use a number line to multiply. Now we're going to look at the place value method, and this is the method that we must always use if we're multiplying a number by 10 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 and so on. In other words, by a power of 10. So here we have our place value scale, and for more information on this, please have a look at my video on place value. So the first one is 6 times 10. So before we start, we need to just remind ourselves that the answer is going to be bigger because we're multiplying. And if we think about our place value scale, the numbers get bigger as we move to the left. So let's put the 6 on there. It's going to be in the units column. And then this is what happens when we multiply it by 10. The 6 has moved one place to the left, and then we've put a placeholder in the units column. So the answer is 60. Another example, this time 56 times 10. Again, look what's happened. The 6 has moved one place to the left, and so has the 5. And then we've put our placeholder in the units column again. So the answer is 560. One more example, let's look at 561 times 10, put it on the scale. What happens when you multiply it by 10? Each one of those digits has moved one place to the left, and then we've put our placeholder in. So the answer is 5,610. Something really important about this, that lots of people make the mistake of thinking we are not just adding zeros. You might think we are, because if you look at 6 multiplied by 10 becomes 60, which is 6 with a 0. If you look at 56 times 10, the answer is 560, which is 56 with a 0. But we must never think of it as adding zeros. What we are doing is we are moving those digits one place to the left and then putting a placeholder in at the end. And there's a really useful tip about this. If we're multiplying by 10, 10 has got 1 0. So we move the digits one place to the left. So 1 0, one place. Something else about this. When we're multiplying by 10, we're making a number 10 times bigger. And that's important to remember and to understand, and that will become clear later on. So now we're going to look at what happens if we multiply a number by 100 this time. So put it on the place value scale. Look what happens. Now this time, the 3 has moved 2 places to the left, and so has the 4. And then we've had to put 2 placeholders in the tens in the units column. So the answer is 4,300. Let's look at this example. 768 times 100. Look what's happened. 8 has moved 2 places to the left. So has the 6. And so has the 7. And then we've got 2 placeholders in again. So the answer is 76,800. So here's the tip. 100 has got 2 zeros. So we move the digits 2 places to the left. Now let's look at what happens if we multiply by 1,000. Again, we know because we're multiplying, the answer's got to get bigger, so the digits are going to move to the left. So now the digits have moved 3 places to the left, and we've got 3 placeholders in there. So the answer is 92,000. And one more example, 7,154 multiplied by 1,000. again, each of those digits has moved 3 places to the left. So the answer is 7,154,000. And you can see that the tip there is that 1,000 has got 3 zeros, so the digits move 3 places to the left. And once again, we must not think of this as simply adding the zeros, as I'll demonstrate in a moment. So following on from the pattern, if we were to multiply by 10,000, which has got 4 zeros, we would move the number 4 places to the left. Multiply by 100,000, which has 5 zeros, move 5 places to the left. If we were to multiply by 1,000,000, which has got 6 zeros, we'd move the digits 6 places to the left, always remembering to put our placeholders in. And the other thing just to say again is if we're multiplying by 100, we're making a number 100 times bigger. If we're multiplying by 1,000, we're making the number 1,000 times bigger. So now we're going to look at doing the same thing, but this time with decimal numbers. So I've got my place value scale there. I've got 5.1 multiplied by 10. So we know what happens to a whole number when we multiply it by 10. Let's see what happens to a decimal number. Okay. So once again, the digits have moved 1 place to the left. And I'm going to show you now why I said that we're not just adding a 0, because if we were to add a 0, this is what the answer would be, 5.10, which is exactly the same as 5.1, because the 0 has no value. If you add it to the end of a decimal number, it doesn't mean anything. We don't need it there. So the answer is 51. Here's another example, 102.45 multiplied by 10. So it's going to move 1 place to the left. All of the digits, every single one of those digits has to move 1 place to the left. So the answer is 1,024.5. Even the 0 has to move across. And again, if we were simply to add the 0 to the end, we would not be changing it at all, because 102.45 is exactly the same as 102.450. Now let's look at a decimal number multiplied by 100, thinking back to the pattern that we've just looked at with whole numbers. Put the 63.49 on there. We multiply it this time by 100. So all of those digits move 2 places to the left. So the answer is 6,349. And then another example with multiplying by 1,000 this time, a decimal number, 27.8. We know from before that each of those digits is going to move 3 places to the left because there are 3 zeros on 1,000. So the answer is 27,800. So now we've looked at how to use the number line for multiplication, and we've looked at the place value method, which we must always use if we're multiplying by those powers of 10. Now we're going to look at what we call the grid method, which is an alternative to the number line and is a bit more compact. It doesn't take up so much space on the page. So here we've got 24 multiplied by 8, which we can read as 24 groups of 8, or if we were to swap those numbers round, which we're allowed to do with multiplication, as 8 groups of 24. So the first thing we're going to have to do is to partition the 24, to split it up. Now this is also explained a bit more on my video on place value. So 24 is made up of a 20 and a 4. Now we're going to draw our grid. So we draw a horizontal line and a vertical line going down near the beginning. And in that corner, we're going to put our multiplication symbol. And that's important to remind us of what we're doing. We're now going to put the 24 along the top, but in its partitioned version. So the 20 goes there. I'm going to leave a space, draw another vertical line down, then the 4, and another vertical line down. So that's my 24. And now I'm going to put the 8 that we need to multiply it by down the left-hand side underneath the multiplication symbol. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply the 20 by 8 and then the 4 by 8. So let's do the 20 by 8 first. And what I like to do in my head to make it a bit simpler is instead of saying 20 times 8, I'm going to say 2 times 8. So 2 8s are 16. But I know from just doing the place value version that 20 is 10 times bigger than the 2. So I need to make my answer 10 times bigger. So each of those digits is going to go one place to the left, and then I put my placeholder in. So the answer is 160. Now I'm going to do 4 times 8, which is 32. So I now have 2 answers to my 24 times 8. So now I need to combine those two to make one answer. And I do that by adding them together. And please refer to my video on addition to see how we do this. So the answer is 192. So now we're going to look at another example. So this time we've got 7 times 93, which we can read as 7 groups of 93, or 93 groups of 7 if we swap those numbers round. So again, we've got a 2-digit number here that we're going to have to partition, the 93. So 93 is made up of a 90 and a 3. Again, we're going to draw our grid with our multiplication symbol in there, and we're going to put the 93 along the top in its partitioned version. So 90, draw a line, 3, draw a line. And what I should have said on the previous page was the reason we leave a little bit of a space before we draw our vertical lines is because the answers that are going to go underneath will be bigger than the numbers along the top of the columns. And now I'm going to put my 7 down the side. So now I've got the 2 squares to fill in. So I'm going to do 90 times 7. But again, in my head, I'm going to do 9 7s, which is 63. But 90 is 10 times bigger than 9. So I need to make my answer 10 times bigger. I need to multiply it by 10. So the answer is 630. And then in the next box, I'm going to do 3 7s, which is 21. So now I've got to add those 2 answers together. And the answer is 651, and that's my final answer. So now let's continue with the grid method, but this time with slightly bigger numbers. So here I've got 32 multiplied by 16. So I've got 2 2-digit numbers here. And again, we can read this as 32 groups of 16 or 16 groups of 32. So the first thing I'm going to do is partition my 32. So 32 is made up of a 30 and a 2. And then if we think about our 16 and we understand our place value, 16 is made up of one lot of 10 and a 6. So now I'm going to draw my grid again. Now it doesn't matter which number goes along the top and which one goes down the side. It really doesn't matter, the answer will be exactly the same. But I'm going to put my 32 in its partitioned version along the top, remembering to leave some space before I do my vertical lines. And that's really, really important because if you don't leave enough space, you're going to make some errors. Now I'm going to put my 16 in its partition version down the left-hand side. So my 10, draw another line, and then a 6. So now I've got 4 boxes that I need to fill in. So first of all, I'm going to multiply the 32 by 10. Now, obviously, if I was simply multiplying it by 10, I would just use the place value method. But obviously, this 10 is part of the 16, so I need to do it on the grid. So I'm going to do 30 times 10. But in my head, I'm going to say 3 times 1 is 3. Then I need to multiply it by 10 because 10 is 10 times bigger than 1. And then I need to multiply it by another 10 because 30 is 10 times bigger than the 3. So my answer is 300. Now I'm going to do 2 lots of 10, which I can simply write as 20. So now I'm going to multiply the 30 and the 2 by the 6. So first of all, 30 times 6. In my head, I'm going to do 3 6s, which are 18. But 30 is 10 times bigger than 3. So I need to multiply my 18 by 10. So thinking about place value, the digits jump one place to the left, and I put my placeholder in. And then we're going to do 2 times 6, which is 12. Now I've got 4 answers, so I need to now combine those together to make one final answer. So I put them in a column, making sure that all the digits are lined up correctly. Again, this is explained in my place value video. I've got 2 units. I've got 1110, so I carry the 10 across, and then I've got 500. And that's my final answer. So continuing with the grid method, let's look at what happens when we have a 2-digit multiplied by a 3-digit number. So this we could read again as 47 groups of 128 or 128 groups of 47. So as before, we're going to have to partition these numbers. So 47 split up into its parts is made up of a 40 and a 7, and 128 is made up of 100 plus a 20 plus an 8. Then we draw our grid as before with our multiplication symbol in there. Now it doesn't matter again which number goes along the top or down the side, but I generally prefer to put the bigger number along the top. So we're going to put the 128 in its partitioned version along the top. So 100, then 20, then our 8, and then down the side we're going to put the 47 as 40 and 7. So now we're going to have 6 boxes to fill in. So I'm going to start by doing 100 times 40. Again, in my head, I'm going to say 1 times 4, which is 4. Make it 10 times bigger for the 40, and then 100 times bigger because of the 100. So the answer is 4,000. Now 20 times 40, in my head, I'm going to say 2 4s, which are 8. Make it 10 times bigger for the 40, and another 10 times bigger for the 20. The answer is 800. And now 8 times 40, 8 4s are 32. Make it 10 times bigger because of the 40. So the answer there is 320. Now I'm going to do 100 times 7, which I could simply do straight away as 700. 20 times 7, well, 2 7s are 14. Make it 10 times bigger because 20 is 10 times bigger than 2. The answer is 140. And then 7 8s are 56. So now I've got 6 answers. And just to say that if you had a 3-digit by 3-digit number, you would then have 3 rows and so on. So you would have then 9 boxes to fill in. So now here we've got 6 answers and we need to combine those together to make one final answer. So I've put them here all lined up correctly in my columns according to their place value. And it would be fine to add them like this, but generally if you have a lot of numbers to add, you can make mistakes. So if you can, and only if you can do this carefully and accurately, you could combine some of those numbers mentally so that you've got a shorter calculation. So I've done that here. I've put the 4,000 with the 800 to make 4,800. I've put the 320 and 700 together, and I've combined the 140 and 56. So now I'm going to add those 3 numbers together instead. And as I say, you're less likely to make errors this way. And again, if you need help with addition, please look at my video on addition. So here we've got 6 units. We've got 1110, so I've carried. I've got 1000, so I'm carrying again, and then I've got 6,000. So the final answer is 6,016. So here's a summary of the grid multiplication method. So step 1 is you partition any numbers in the question, obviously that are 2-digit or more. You then draw your grid with a multiplication symbol in the top left-hand corner and make sure the boxes are big enough for your answers. Write the partition numbers along the top and down the left-hand side of the grid. Multiply each column by each row, and then you add the answers together. Note that this method can also be used for decimal numbers, but you'll need to convert all the numbers into whole numbers first and then replace the decimal point in the answer. So please see how to do this later in the video when it's covered in the column method. So we're now going to look at the column method that I've just referred to, and it is the most efficient of all the multiplication methods. It takes up the least space on the page, and once we get used to it, it's really quite quick. So we're going to start with multiplying whole numbers using the column method. So we've got 43 times 5, And as the name suggests, we need to set this out in a column. So the most important thing here is that we put the digits in the correct columns according to their place value. So the 3 and the 5 are in the units column, the 4 is in the tens column. It doesn't actually matter which way round we have those numbers. We could have the 43 at the bottom and the 5 at the top, but I prefer always to have the biggest number along the top. I've got my 2 lines for my answer underneath, and then my multiplication symbol, which I always like to put to the right of the calculation so that it's out of the way. Now, as with other column calculations, we always start from the right and work towards the left. So the first thing I'm going to say to myself is, what is 5 times 3? The answer is 15. I know that I can't have more than one digit in a column, so I leave my 5 in the units column from the 15 and I carry the 1, the left-hand digit, across because actually it represents 10. 15 is made up of 10 plus 5, and I carry it across underneath, very important, into my tens column. So now I'm going to multiply the 4 by the 5. So 5 times 4 is 20. But then I have to add on my carried digit, and that comes to 21, which I simply write like that, making sure that the digits are in the correct columns. I don't need to carry the 2 underneath because I've finished with the calculation, so the 2 can go straight into my answer. So that's my final answer. Let's look at another example. Here we've got a 3-digit number multiplied by a 1-digit number. We've got 156 multiplied by 4. Again, I set this out in columns, making sure that my digits are in the correct columns. I've got my 2 lines for my answer and my multiplication symbol off to the right. So I'm going to start on the right-hand side again and work towards the left. So the first thing I'm going to say is, what's 4 times 6? And I always read the bottom number first, so go 4 times 6. 4 6s are 24. I can't write 24 in my units column, so I'm going to leave the 4 there and I'm going to carry the 20 across underneath to my tens column. Now I'm going to say what's 4 times 5. 4 5s are 20, and then I have to remember to add on my carry digit, so that's 22. And again, I'm going to have to carry the 20 across. And now I've got to do 4 times 1, which is 4, plus the carry 2 from the 22, which is 6. And I can put that straight into my answer. So my final answer is 624. And I've colour-coded those so that you can see which numbers are the answers to which steps. So we've used the column method to multiply a number by a single digit. Now let's look at how we use this method when we're multiplying a number by a 2-digit number. So here we've got 2 by 2 digits, 67 multiplied by 21. Again, we set them out in a column or in columns, making sure that the digits are in the correct columns according to their place value. So what we do, again, we've got our lines for our answer and our multiplication symbol off to the right. We're going to pretend that this is 1 times 67. So we're going to ignore the 20 for the moment and just do as we did before. So we say 1 times 7 and write the answer underneath. And then we do 1 times 6 and then we write the answer for that. So we've multiplied the 67 by the 1. We now need to multiply it by the 20. So what we do now is we write or draw another line underneath because we're going to have a second answer here. Now, the 2 in the 20 represents 20. It doesn't represent 2. So we can't say 2 times 7 until we have told the calculation that it actually is a 20. And the way we do this is that we put a placeholder in the units column. And I'm going to highlight that so that we remember it, because that is the thing that everybody forgets to do. So once we've done that, the calculation knows that the 2 is a 20, And then we can simply just carry on as before. We can just call it a 2 in our head. And so we just do as we did before with the 1. We start on the right-hand side. So we say 2 times 7, which is 14. Now 14 has got 2 digits, so I have to carry the 10 across from the 14 to the hundreds column. And then I say 2 times 6, which is 12, and then I have to add on the 1 to make 13, and I can simply then just write that in the answer because I've finished. So now I've got 2 answers. I've got 67 and I've got 1,340. So I need to combine those together to make my final answer. So I need to add those 2 together. So I add my units, my tens, my hundreds, and my thousand. So my final answer is 1,407. Be really careful with a couple of things here. First of all, with your carried digits, that they are smaller than your final answers, otherwise you'll get in a mess with that. And be careful that you only add up the answers and not any numbers above that top line. Now let's look at another example. Set out again with the digits in the correct columns. So we're going to start by multiplying the 18 by the right-hand digit of the bottom number, the 5. So 5 times 8 is 40, and then 5 times 1, which is 5, plus the 4 that we've carried, makes 9. Now I have to multiply the 18 by the 40. So I draw my line underneath, and I need to remember that to tell the calculation that it's 40 and not 4, I have to put that placeholder in again. I've just put a star there to remind you because it's so easy to forget. And now in my head I can simply say 4 times 8, which is 32, 4 times 1, which is 4, plus the 3 that I've carried into the hundreds column, makes 7. And then I add those 2 answers together, the 90 and the 720. And there's my final answer. So we're going to have a look at another example, this time multiplying a 3-digit by a 2-digit number, 204 times 75. Lay those numbers out in correct columns, and then as before we're going to multiply the top number by the right-hand digit of the bottom number, so the 5. So 5 times 4 is 20. 5 times the 0 is 0, but we've got the carried 2, so that 2 then goes into our answer. And then 5 times the 2 is 10, which I can write straight into my answer. Now, as before, we then have to multiply the top number by the 7, but again, because it's in the tens column, we know that that's actually a 70, so we have to tell the calculation that. We do that by putting that placeholder into the units column, and then we carry on as before, and in our head we can just say 7. So 7 times 4 is 28, then 7 times the 0 is 0, but we've got again a carried 2 there, so that 2 then goes into the answer, and then 7 times the 2 is 14. So we've got the 2 answers there, 1,020 and 14,280, and we need to combine those together to make our final answer. So there's our units, our tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. So our final answer is 15,300. And if you need any help with the carrying and understanding about addition, please do look at my other videos, one on place value and the other one on addition. Now we're going to look at what happens if we multiply by a 3-digit number. So again, we set the digits out in their columns. And just as before, we're going to multiply that top number by the right-hand digit of the bottom number. So 1 times 3 is 3. 1 times the 2 is 2. And 1 times the 5 is 5. Then we draw our line. Now we're going to multiply that top number by the 4. but it's a 40 because it's in the tens column, so we have to tell the calculation that, and we do that with our placeholder in our units column. And then in our head we can just simply say 4 3s are 12, 4 times 2 is 8, plus the carried 1, which is 9, and then 4 times 5 is 20. Now we have to multiply that top number by the 6. Now the 6 is in the hundreds column, so it's not actually a 6, it's a 600. And we have to tell the calculation this. So what we do, we draw another line because we've got a third answer here that's going to go in here. And the way we tell the calculation that that's actually a 600 is by putting in 2 placeholders. And then we can just carry on as before. So we say 6 times 3 is 18. 6 times the 2 is 12, plus the carried 1, which is 13. And then 6 times the 5 is 30, plus the carried 1, which is 31. And now we've got 3 answers. We've got 523, 20,920, and 313,800, which we then have to combine into one final answer. So be really careful here that you don't add any of the numbers above that top line. It's very easy to do that. So our units, adding them together, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, and 100,000s. And you can see how essential it is that we line all of our digits up really, really carefully. So our final answer is 335,243. So far we've focused on how to multiply whole numbers. Now we're going to look at how to multiply decimal numbers. So for example, we might be asked to do 23.7 multiplied by 6. And the first crucial step that we need to remember when we're multiplying decimals is this: to remove the decimal point first. So what we're going to do is we're going to read this calculation as 237 multiplied by 6. So we're going to take the decimal point out of the 23.7. We're going to set it out in a column, just as we've done before, and we know how to do this. So we say 6 times 7 is 42, remembering to carry digits across if we have an answer that has more than one digit. We then say 6 times 3, which is 18, plus the 4 is 22, and then 6 times the 2 is 12, plus the carried 2, which is 14. So that's our answer to the 237 multiplied by 6. So now what we have to do is we have to remember to put the decimal point back into our answer. And the way we do this is this: we look at the original question and we look at how many decimal places there are, and we have to look at both of the numbers, both the 23.7 and the 6. Well, the 6 is a whole number, so there are no decimal places. If we look at the 23.7, we've got one decimal place there. So altogether, we've got one decimal place in the question. So we have to make sure that there's one decimal place in our answer. So our final answer would be 142.2. So what we've done is we've put the decimal point between those 2's in the 1422, which gives us an answer to one decimal place. Let's look at this example. So we've got 3.53 multiplied by 14.6. So the first thing we need to do is take those decimal places or decimal points out. So instead we're going to read this as 353 multiplied by 146. We then lay it out in columns and carry on with a column multiplication. So 6 times 3 is 18. 6 times the 5 is 30, plus the 1 is 31. And then 6 times the 3, which is 18, plus the 3, which is 21. We then are going to multiply that top number by the 4, but we have to remember to tell the calculation it's 40. So we put our placeholder in. 4 3s are 12. 4 times 5 is 20, plus the carried 1, 21. Then 4 times 3 is 12, plus the carried 2 is 14. And then we're going to multiply the top number by the 1, but we have to remember to tell the calculation it's actually 100, not a 1. So we do that by putting our 2 placeholders in. And then we say 1 times 3 is 3. 1 times 5 is 5, and 1 times 3 is 3. Then we add those all up, so units, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000. So our answer to the 353 multiplied by 146 is 51,538. And then what we do is we go back to our original question and look to see how many decimal places there are, looking at both numbers. So when I say decimal places, digits to the right of the decimal point. So we've got 2 in the 3.53 and 1 in the 14.6. So together that's 3 decimal places. So we have to make sure that there are 3 decimal places in our answer. So the answer to the original question would be 51.538. And you can see there that there are 3 decimal digits in our answer, the 5, the 3 and the 8. So let's look at one more example. Here we've got 72 multiplied by 54.01. So the first step again is remove the decimal point. So we read this as 72 multiplied by 5,401. Then we set it out, and then we carry on with our column multiplication. So 2 times the 1 is 2, 2 times 0 is 0, 2 4s, 8, 2 5s, 10. Draw our line. Remember to tell our calculation that that 7 is 70, not 7. So we need our placeholder. 7 times 1 is 7. 7 times 0 is 0. 7 times 4 is 28. And 7 5s are 35, plus the 2, 37. Add those together. Units, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s and 100,000s. So our answer to the 72 multiplied by 5,401 is 388,872. Now we look again in our original question and see how many decimal places there are altogether, and there are 2. There are no decimal places in the 72 because it's a whole number. So we have to make sure that we have 2 decimal places in our answer. So we have to put the decimal point back into that number, and we put it there so that the 7 and the 2 are to the right of the decimal point. So that is our final answer. And just to remind ourselves, the key to multiplying decimals is to remove the decimal point first, and don't forget to put it back into our answer. So we've looked at how to use the column method for multiplying whole numbers and decimal numbers. Now I'm just going to go back over the grid method, but this time for decimal numbers. I mentioned it, but I didn't actually show you how to do it. And some people prefer the grid method. So if we take this example, 21.4 multiplied by 43.2, again, the first step is to take those decimal points out. So instead, let's read it as 214 multiplied by 432. Now, if you remember, when we use the grid method, we have to partition the numbers first. So 214 is made up of 200 plus 10 plus 4, and 432 is made up of 430 and 2. We then draw our grid with our multiplication symbol, and again it doesn't matter which number goes along the top and which one down the side. I'm going to put the 214 along the top. using its partitioned part. So let's do the 200, then a space, vertical line, the 10, and then the 4. And then I'm going to put the 432 down the left-hand side. So we put 400, then 30, and then 2 separated by the lines. And now I'm going to find the answers that go in all of those squares. So I'm going to start by multiplying the 200 by the 400. So I'm going to say 2 times 4 is 8, multiplied by 100 because 400 is 100 times bigger than 4, and then multiplied by the other 100 for the 200. So the answer to that is 80,000. Now I'm going to do 10 times 400, so 1 times 4 is 4. Multiply that by 100 because 400 is 100 times bigger than 4, and then multiplied by 10 for the 10 above. And then I'm going to do 4 times 400, 4 4s are 16, make that 100 times bigger for the 400. Then I'm going to do 200 times 30, 2 times 3 is 6, times 10 for the 30, times 100 for the 200. Then I'm going to do 10 times 30, so 1 times 3 is 3, times 10 for the 30, and then times by another 10, because 10 is 10 times bigger than 1. And then the final box says 4 times 30, so I'm going to do 4 times 3, which is 12, make that 10 times bigger, because 30 is 10 times bigger than the 3. And now I'm going to do the final row. So I'm going to do 200 times 2, so we could say 2 times 2 is 4, times by the 100, because 200 is 100 times bigger than 2. So that's 400. We probably could have just written that straight in. 2 times 10 is 20, and then 2 times 4 is 8. So now we've got 9 numbers that we need to add together for our final answer. So those are the 9 numbers. Now you can see what a huge calculation that is. So it's not really advisable to add so many numbers together. The first thing you have to be really careful of is that you put all of the digits in the correct columns, and that you haven't made any mistakes copying them out either. That's very easy to do, particularly with all of those zeros. So instead of adding all of those together, I'm actually going to group them. So I'm going to add the 2 top numbers together, then the next 2, then the next 2, and then the next 2. And I can do that easily mentally. So choose numbers that you can add together easily in your head, and then leave any others. So now I've got a calculation that has just the 4 numbers, and then I'm going to add that together once I've made sure, of course, that all the numbers are in the correct columns. And that's our answer. So that's the answer, though, to 214 multiplied by 432. So now I have to look at my original question and look at how many decimal places there are in that question. And I can see that there are 2. There's 1 on one side and 1 on the other. So I need to make sure that I've then got 2 decimal places in my answer. So that's the answer to the final question. I've put the decimal point between the 4s, and then I have 2 decimal points, 2 decimal digits to the right of that, the 4 and the 8, and that's my final answer. So now I'm just going to recap the column multiplication method. So the first step is to line up the digits in the correct columns. The order of the numbers does not matter, but it's easier to have the biggest number at the top. Remember to put your multiplication symbol into the calculation. I prefer to put it to the right. Draw 2 lines underneath for the answer. Then multiply each digit of the top number by each digit of the bottom number, beginning with the units digit in the bottom number. Use a new line for answers to each digit of the bottom number, and remember to put placeholders into the answers to tell the calculation that you are multiplying by a tens. So 1 placeholder for that, or hundreds, 2 placeholders for that, etc. And then you add up all the answers. And then when multiplying decimals, do exactly above, but take any decimal points out first. So in other words, turn all the numbers into whole numbers. When you have the answer, count how many decimal digits are in the original question, both numbers, that's really important, and put the decimal point into your answer so that there are the same number of decimal places. And just as an aside, we should always estimate first before we do calculations and then check our answers against these estimates. So for more information on how to do that, please have a look at my video on estimating and rounding. So here's a practice page in case you'd like to have a go at some on your own, and you may want to pause the video at this point so that the answers don't come up too quickly. So the answer to number 1 is 445, number 2, 903, number 3, 1664, number 4, 12,508, the next one 524.8, then 74.88, 18.144, and finally 4,590. Now, did you remember to use the place value method for the last one? Thank you for watching, and I do hope that you found this video useful. Please also have a look at my other videos on primary maths and SATS help.